background you're hearing gospel stories. Why are the gospels called gospels? Well, yes, that's almost true. Yes, they are good news. It comes from euangelion, which is a Greek word that Mark uses in the beginning of his gospel. And Mark is usually regarded as the first written gospel. And so when he uses the word gospel to describe his story, the other gospels then got called gospels, and that became a fairly standard thing. But Mark didn't make up the word gospel. He didn't make up the word euangelion, which means, in a Roman context, it means the proclamation of how the Roman emperor is going to bring peace to the world. And in a Jewish context, it speaks about, in Isaiah, about how God is going to establish his rule in the world. So good news is not just good news, your sins are forgiven, or good news, you'll get to heaven. It is the proclamation of how God is bringing about his rule in the world. In the same way that Isaiah looked forward to the time when God would establish peace in the world, and in the same way that the Roman emperors claimed to be establishing peace in the world. Mark used the word euangelion, which got translated in Old Anglo-Saxon, for those who care about Old Anglo-Saxon, which is Godspell, which is, they turned into a musical. Godspell, see, that's where it comes from. You were going to say that, but then you decided that in this new year you were going to be nice. No, so Godspell, good story, good news, and comes into English as modern English as gospel. And so this is not just the good news of our salvation, but the good news of God bringing peace to the world. Why are there 4 gospels? For those who haven't been paying attention, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 gospels. Why are there 4? Well, if you were somebody who believes that numbers are important, you might say, well, because there are 4 points on a compass. And some early Christian theologians said that that was why we had 4 gospels. But the reason we have 4 gospels is because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote a gospel that added up to 4, and there's no magic in the number 4. It's just the number we have. But it leads to a kind of different question. Why do we need 4 versions of the gospel? Different audience and different writers with different emphasis. And there are many stories in common between the 4 gospels, but they each have a distinctive flavor, a distinctive emphasis to them. And that's why some of us have favorite gospels, because the emphasis speaks to us, the kind of focus on it. Now, Gospels are what we call the full book, from the beginning, Matthew chapter 1 all the way through to Matthew 28. But they're broken up into smaller units. The technical term for a unit in the Gospel is pericope, but you will not have to remember that until the final exam in December of this year. So until then, you can forget pericope. But it means that we're always looking, when we read the Gospels, when we explore them, we're looking at smaller units, smaller stories. But these stories all fit within a bigger story of the Gospel. So it is good to be able to read the Gospel from beginning to end. It doesn't take super long to do that, and to get that full kind of sweep. But to remember that even the Gospel is part of the grand narrative that runs from Genesis through to Revelation. So every story is only part of the story. And so every story has a kind of different emphasis. Sometimes it repeats an emphasis from somewhere else. Sometimes it's a new focus or a new thought. But it allows us to get a different perspective. There's one famous New Testament scholar, Jimmy Dunn, who wrote a book called The Parting of the Ways. So when I published my PhD thesis, I called it Parting of the Ways as well. So people who were looking for his book might end up with mine. They'd be disappointed, but at least then there was but Jimmy Dunn talks about the four Gospels recording the impression that Jesus makes on people. When Jesus speaks and there's a crowd of people around him, each person has a different impression of Jesus, the impact that he has on them. And so these four Gospels capture some of that, the different impact. And so one Gospel gives you a sense of the impact of Jesus on Luke, or Matthew, Mark, or John. But collectively, they give us a more rounded, a fuller picture of Jesus. So all four Gospels are useful. And the last thing I'd mention, just in kind of background, is that the Gospels were written to be heard. First of all, they were oral stories. They were stories that people told before they were being collected into written form. But even when they were collected into written form, they were still written for the ear. Most people in the time of Jesus, time of the early church, were illiterate. Most of them were would only hear the gospel. They wouldn't read them, wouldn't see them, they would hear them. And so in our time, we spend our time seeing it and not hearing it. And so I think I want to encourage you to hear the gospel as we get through them. And so when we come to the story, we'll have an opportunity to hear it. You don't need to open your Bible to read it. Practice a little first century kind of stuff and listen to the story. How does it impact you as you listen to it? Well, there we go. Did you do that? Did I do that? You did that? Oh, I did it. Right. So this is just, the gospel tells the story of Jesus. Matthew begins with a genealogy and then Christmas story. Luke begins with a Christmas story. He doesn't bring in the genealogy until after the baptism. John starts off with a cosmic introduction. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So they each start differently, but all of them, and this is come together in their storytelling with the baptism of Jesus. And we're going to look at the baptism of Jesus next week when Luke preaches on that. But the baptism of Jesus is the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, and in Mark's gospel he jumps straight to that, and each of the gospels tell that story. Then after the baptism, there are a number of stories about Jesus, but they're not always in the same order. There are sayings by Jesus, but they're not always word for word the same. But they move through the stories of Jesus and the sayings of Jesus. And then the last third of the Gospels focus on Jesus' final week. When he enters into Jerusalem, he preaches in the temple, he gets crucified and resurrected. So there's a kind of general structure to it that they share because they're telling the story of Jesus. But there are different emphases, and so some of the stories are told in different orders. Matthew has a habit of taking lots of material and bringing it together. It just makes it easier in the way that he tells the story. Luke has them spread out just the way that they do it. But it does suggest to me, if the Gospels can be written in different orders and the words are a bit different in the various stories and with different emphasis, it means there's no one correct way of understanding any particular story. And so when we read a story, we're going to get a different kind of impression on us. And that's okay. That's the point of listening to the story. If they just wanted you to get a single straight theological thought, they would have written an epistle. They would have written like Paul does. But they want you to engage with Jesus, to meet Jesus, to be challenged by Jesus. And that, I think, is what we learn as we read through the Gospels. All right, so between Christmas and Jesus' baptism, we read, it starts off in Luke chapter 2, verse 41, when Jesus was 12 years old, his family attended the Passover festival in Jerusalem as usual. And then the story unfolds. And then after the story is told, Luke kind of summarizes it all and gives a linking bit into the story between that and Jesus' baptism. What did Jesus do between the ages of 12 and 30? Well, the answer here is here in Luke 2, where it says, Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. So I want to start with the end and then go back to the beginning, because I think that will help us with the actual story itself. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. Where have you read something like that, very similar to that, in the Old Testament? That's a tricky question. It's, if you've been reading 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 26, you would have read the boy Samuel grew taller and grew in favor with the Lord and with the people. So Luke takes that description of Samuel and applies it to Jesus. Now I think that is fairly interesting, in that by doing that, Luke is saying Jesus is not the first and only child who grew in favor with God and the people. Jesus is human. Like Samuel, he grew in stature, he grew in wisdom, and he grew in favor with God and the people. Luke describes a genuine incarnational Jesus. Incarnational, Jesus in the flesh, God in the flesh, fully human. Now, I find that for people outside the church, it can be hard to convince them that Jesus is fully God. But inside the church, it's kind of hard to convince them that Jesus is fully human. You may not have said this to me, and if you did say it to me, I've forgotten it, so I'm not referring to you in particular. But I have heard a number of times, well, that doesn't count. Jesus is God. I can't be like Jesus. I can't follow the way of Jesus because Jesus is God. Jesus isn't human like me. And Luke says to you, yes, you can, because Jesus is human. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. Perhaps not one of the favorite Christmas carols is the one that says, little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. I mean, because he's God. Born as God. That's not the story that Luke tells. It's not the story the Gospels tell. The story the Gospels tell is of an incarnational God. A God who comes in the flesh and grows and develops just like we grow and develop. In Hebrews chapter 2 it says, the Son of God came to help the descendants of Abraham. Therefore it was necessary for him to be made in every respect like us, so that he could be a merciful and faithful high priest before God, Since he himself has gone through suffering and testing, he is able to help us when we are being tested. To be made, it was necessary for God to enter into the world and to be made in every respect like us. What we have gone through is what Jesus went through and has gone through. Now, of course, there are differences between growing up in sunny Adelaide or rain-drenched Scotland. There are differences in experiences, but the experience of growing up is really common in the way that happens. And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. Jesus is real. Jesus is not just a phantom, a spiritual phantom that flits through light. He is real and has gone through what we have gone, and so that we can actually go through life like Jesus does. So Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. One of the reasons he grew in favor with all the people was that he grew in wisdom. His understanding of who God is and the ways of God were such that the people around him in Nazareth were attracted to him. Jesus was born of the Spirit and lived in the Spirit, and so he saw the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If this is the kind of fruit that Jesus saw, you can see why people were attracted to him. But all of these fruit are ours as people who live in the Spirit. We can have love, joy, and peace. We can have patience. We can have kindness. I mean, surely, kindness is what the world needs now. Goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. These are the things that, if people don't like Christians, it shouldn't be because we have pains in the neck. I have known some Christians who were easy to dislike because they weren't living with the fruit of the Spirit. They were living with judgment and criticism, harshness, lack of joy. I can think of multiple movies in which the Christian character is mean and miserable. It's very hard to think of movies in which the Christian is filled with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. This is the character of Jesus. If you look at the stories of Jesus, you see him evidence love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, and he grew in favor with all the people. But I want to make a point here that this is chapter 2 of the book. You just have to go 2 more chapters, and everybody in Nazareth turns against Jesus and wants to kill him. Right? So just because you are being faithful and showing the signs of faith doesn't mean that the people of God, and these are the people around Jesus, the people of God, are always on your side, because, and I said this last week, so I don't expect you to remember, God is a surprising God. And if you follow a surprising God, there are going to be people who are offended. So you don't live for the favor of people. But if you live faithfully, I think you can expect the favor of people a lot of times. But more interesting, I think, this morning is the next bit. Jesus grew in favor with God. Jesus grew in favor with God. How do you grow in favor with God? Now, some of us think that God is pleased with us when we don't sin. when we quit sinning. And that might be partially true, but it can be true in this instance, right? Because the Gospels and the New Testament are confident that Jesus lived without sin. So Jesus didn't grow in favor with God by not sinning, because he didn't sin. So what was he doing when he was growing in favor with God? Obeying, but let's back a little bit to the sin thing. If Jesus is always being obedient to God, how is he growing in favor? Where's the growth in that? So what I want to suggest is that growing in favor with God is not about what you don't do. Don't sin. It's about what you do. So living with God, in relationship with God, in engagement with God, with having the fruit of the Spirit, allowing that to go through your life. This is how you grow in favor with God, by leading into a relationship with God and allowing ourselves to grow with God and to grow in our ways and understanding of God. The goal of your Christian life in 2025 is not to quit sinning. It is to grow in favor with God. Now, if you grow in favor with God, I'm putting money on it, you're going to quit sinning. But you don't. If I ask you to not think of a pink elephant, what are you going to do? You're going to think about pink elephant. So the only way to stop thinking of what you stop thinking of? Yeah, a pink elephant, because you're still thinking of a pink elephant, is to think of a purple hippopotamus. If you start to think of a purple hippopotamus, you got no one to think of what was that? Was that some kind of elephant? So you've got to put your focus on the positive, not just try and stop doing the negative. Right? You can grow in favor with God by just trying to stop things. You grow in favor by leading into your relationship with God, knowing God better, growing in your commitment and your understanding of God's ways. So with that as the kind of what looks somewhere was, let's go back to the story of Jesus. Now every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When Jesus was 12 years old, they attended the festival as usual. After the celebration was over, they started home to Nazareth, but Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't miss him at first, because they assumed he was among the other travelers. But when he didn't show up that evening, they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they couldn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem to search for him there. 3 days later, they finally discovered him in the temple, seated among the religious teachers, listening to them and asking questions. All who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. His parents didn't know what to think. His mother said to him, "Why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been frantic, searching for you everywhere." "But why did you need to search?" Jesus asked. "Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they didn't understand what he meant. Then he returned to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And his mother stored all these things in her heart. The story that Luke tells here is of a Jesus who has an understanding of God as his Father and his sense of understanding of the ways of God and the purposes and the plans of God. So, as a 12-year-old, now 12-year-old in Jesus' social group is still a child, not yet a man, still a child. But it was not uncommon in both the Jewish context and the Greco-Roman context for stories of great men to have a bit about when they were a child of 12 years old and how advanced they were already in their understanding. So maybe Luke is telling the story of this time because it's a way of saying that Jesus was already significant and notable at the time of his youth. And what was made him noticeable was his wisdom and his understanding of that particular special relationship with God. And Luke highlights that by Mary saying to him, "Your father and I were frantic." So she calls Joseph Jesus his father, but Jesus also says, "I'm in my father's house, in God's father's house." And so there's that bit of Jesus is both and. Mary maybe didn't know. Mary understood many things, but she was always pondering in her heart because it was hard to know. I mean, this is back to last week with it being surprising. It is just surprising all that Mary had to gain. And so even here, she's storing these things up in her heart, reflecting on them. What do they mean? That Jesus, who knew God as Father and knew the Father's business, was being obedient to his higher calling. What is our purpose in life? What is our meaning in life? Is to live for God, to be involved in his business, to seek after him. Jesus both asked and answered questions. I think this gives us a sense of Jesus was drawing and learning the great stories of God that are in the Old Testament and the understanding of that. So he was asking questions and exploring that, looking back. But he was also challenging and looking forward to what God was doing differently. So we get both asking and answering questions. He shows wisdom and discernment. Wisdom of the past, what God has done, and discernment about what God is doing in the future. So there is much of this story that makes us think, well, Jesus is a standout, but not in a way that we can also live our lives with a focus on God as our Father and an understanding of God and his ways. We can learn that. But I want to briefly just close this with a question. If Jesus is without sin, how come he upset his mother and his father? Because in my family, upsetting your mother and father is considered bad fault. Right? Isn't it a sin to cause grief? Mary and Joseph think Jesus is traveling with them. Why? Because in the morning, when they were all getting organized, and Mary had other children at this point, trying to get them all organized, the 12-year-old was out with his pals. And he knew what was going on. He didn't say anything about, well, before I leave, I'm going down to the temple, catch me on the way out. He just disappeared. But they thought he was a sensible kid. They'd known him for 12 years. He'd done pretty well up to then. And they thought, and so they expected him to be there. How frantic do you get? We've lost a child. We started with 2, we ended up with 2, but in the middle, there was a time where we lost one of the kids with the children. Lost them, couldn't find them anywhere. Frankly, going around the shops and trying to cut off the excess and where they gone. My daughter managed to lose my granddaughter a couple of weeks ago. Ran out of Target. Some women brought her back, but the guard who was on the door was asked, did the kid come by? No. You get kind of frantic when you lose a kid. Now, 3 days could be 1 day traveling, 1 day back, and 1 day looking, or it could be 1 day out, 1 day back, 3 days looking. It can get pretty frantic. It can be quite hostile. And so Mary doesn't talk it because she's a little calmer in this point. Joseph probably had things he wanted to say. But Mary said, why did you do this to us? And Jesus, because he was a 12-year-old, didn't get it. Jesus wasn't lost. At no point did Jesus not know where he was. It was the parents who were lost. They were the ones who had wandered off. Hadn't seen them for ages. I don't know where they went. But he was fine. He was doing his thing. When you are 12, you see the world from your point of view. You can't project yourself into the mind of your mother or your father. That's just not, you're not there yet. I take from that in this story that developmental issues, just being human, growing up, isn't a sin. Sin isn't about being perfect. Sin is about being away from God. It's not about just living perfect lives. I mean, being sick isn't a sin. Being frustrated is not a sin. Being 12 and not understanding why your parents are upset is not a sin. Being 3 and unable to stay still is not a sin. We have to be careful and not think that anything that falls from being perfect or anything that irritates me or bothers me is somebody else sinning. Sin is like that. This story tells us that Jesus was real. He acted like a real 12-year-old boy. Yes, he had wisdom. Yes, he had insight into God. But he was still a 12-year-old boy. And we are just human, like Jesus. We can grow in favor with God in 2025. Jesus is just like us and just like God. We can be like Jesus. To do that, we need to spend time with Jesus, and that's what we're going to try and do this year in the reading with curiosity and imagination about Jesus, the stories he told and the stories about him. And as we do that, I would hope that we come not to believe in Jesus, but to love Jesus. To love him is as our God and Lord. Because when we love Jesus, we will become like him. We become like that which we love. So this isn't an abstract, can I learn more about Jesus? But can I fall in love more with Jesus? Following Jesus will take us to surprising places. Because Jesus surprised me. And if we're going to follow after him, we will surprise people. But it comes from wanting to love Jesus, to be like Jesus, and to grow in favor with God and with others in 2025.